All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. This is a webinar on the update to the Builder's Remedy under the new bill AB 1893 that passed last year in 2024. We had originally scheduled this for, December, but it is now January. We postponed it because of just things being busy around the holiday time. And just want to welcome everybody. Thank you for hanging in there with us and joining us. I'm excited to welcome my recurring guest, Ken Stahl from the Chapman University Law School, Environmental Science and Real Estate chair of that department within the law school, and also of counsel with Miller Star Regalia, a very prominent land use law firm here in California. And excited to partner with him again to bring more unpacking of recent legislation and what it means for the development community. And so want to just invite him to come up and unmute himself and teach us all some new things.
Well, the joke's on you because I never muted myself. But thank you, Liz. It's always a pleasure to be here with People for Housing. I'm so glad you're all here. I hope this is going to be a really interesting and informative webinar, and I look forward to your comments and questions. This is really exciting for me. As many of you know, there's been a huge amount of discussion over the last few years about this so-called builder's remedy. And I myself have been part of that conversation. I've done 3 previous webinars for People for Housing about the builder's remedy. This particular webinar is going to take us beyond the builder's remedy to other parts of the Housing Accountability Act, particularly talking about other changes made by this recent piece of legislation called AB 1893, which just took effect January 1st, 2025. The reason I'm excited is, Builder's Remedy has gotten so much attention. It's got the catchy name, which is something we'll talk about later. It's got, the really exciting potential to really transform, land use and housing policy in California. But it's been talked about so much that it's almost eclipsed all of the other many things and many powerful things that the Housing Accountability Act can do, and the many important changes that AB 1893 has made to those other parts of the Housing Accountability Act. So I'm happy to be able to discuss that with you. Liz, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide, I appreciate it. So just a little bit about me. For those who don't know, Liz kind of gave you the introduction, but I really just want to very briefly, hopefully make you feel assured that I kind of know what I'm talking about a little bit. I am the director of the Environmental Land Use and Real Estate Law program at Chapman University's Fowler School of Law. I also work with Miller Star Regalia, where I have litigated HAA lawsuits and also assisted developers and housing organizations through the entitlement process under state housing law, including Builder's Remedy and other parts of the Housing Accountability Act. And Liz and I, we're going to have to change that last one because I think it's been more than 6 years now that we've been working together with People for Housing. But that's just to give you a little bit about me. Next slide, please. Here's another standard caveat that I've given in the previous webinars. I'm not in a position in this webinar to be giving legal advice because every project is unique. And so I cannot say all of the things that might apply to your specific project or your specific city. What I can say is state housing law and local zoning codes and local general plans are extremely complex. And I would definitely recommend that you speak with me or another land use attorney before headed down the path of pursuing an entitlement or housing development project under the HAA. Just want to make sure I put that out there before we move to the next slide. Great. So now here's what you came for, the takeaways. I'm going to give you a couple, starting with if you'll show me the first bullet point. So Builder's Remedy, I'm going to say a little bit about the Builder's Remedy, but I've already done 3 previous webinars, and I think later I'll show you the links to the previous webinars for those of you who want to learn more about Builder's Remedy. Builder's Remedy is the name given to a law that applies when a city does not have a housing element of their general plan that has been approved by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. What's happening now, of course, is more and more cities are getting their housing elements determined to be compliant by HCD, which means Builder's Remedy projects may become scarcer in the future as we advance through this 8-year cycle of regional housing needs assessment. However, moving to our next bullet point.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's a dramatic pause.
There we go.
The point of the builder's remedy is not for you to get a compliant housing element so then you don't have to do anything. The point is to incentivize cities to get a compliant housing element, because then that gives rise to new enforceable commitments. The housing element is supposed to be a commitment that can actually be enforced. So it's not builder's remedy or nothing. It's builder's remedy or the enforceable commitments that are available under the compliant housing element. Okay, next, please. Okay, next, as we talk about some of these enforceable commitments, one of the ways in which the fact that a jurisdiction has a compliant housing element may be helpful for developers is it may give additional options for developers under CEQA that may not be available for traditional builder's remedy projects, particularly the Section 151A3 CEQA exemption, which I will talk about towards the end of the presentation, is potentially very powerful, especially in situations where a jurisdiction has a compliant housing element. Next. Yes, and then aside from the housing element stuff, and aside from the builder's remedy, AB 1893, this new bill that just took effect January 1st, provides a lot of goodies for housing projects. All housing projects, not just builder's remedy. And specifically, I think I've got one more bullet point on here, maybe two. Yes, what we're seeing with a lot of these new laws is a bit of a shift in housing law from substance to process. What I mean by that, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit more later, is as housing law is getting better at dictating substance and making it kind of boxing cities in on what they can and can't do. Cities are more and more trying to use procedural shenanigans to try to block projects they don't like. And the state law in response is tightening the screws, making it harder for cities to play those games. So what this has meant is that housing law, we're seeing a little bit focusing more on process in AB 1893 than on substance, a little bit. Do I have another one there? Oh, yes. So cities are playing more games now, but the law is working harder to stop them. That's the takeaway there. So, okay, those are your kind of main takeaways from this webinar. Okay, so just as background, the builder's remedy. Yes, here is the slide that has my previous webinars and slides. Again, I did 3 webinars on builder's remedy. There's also a lot of other great resources out there about the builder's remedy. It's been talked about for several years at this point. So I'm not going to go into it in detail, but absolutely feel free to check out the YouTube videos and the slides about builder's remedy. But anyway, as background, we have this state law that's underneath or within a powerful statute called the Housing Accountability Act, Government Code 65589.5. Paragraph D6 of the HAA, formerly paragraph D5. So this is confusing because AB 1893 changed around some of the numbers of the sections and stuff. So currently, subdivision or paragraph D6, which was formerly D5, prohibits cities or counties that from disapproving or unreasonably conditioning projects that contain a designated percentage of affordable housing if the city does not have a substantially compliant housing element. All right, so that sentence I just said is the subject of a lot of discussion, and that's all covered in the previous webinars. But of course, there's now this next question, which I alluded to at the beginning, which is, well, what if your city has a compliant housing element? Because the way that this builder's remedy law is phrased, as you see here, it only applies if the city does not have a substantially compliant housing element. So what happens if your city does have a compliant housing element? Here we have the other builder's remedy. And here's where I'm going to mention the name. Again, builder's remedy, great name. Really praise. And by the way, footnote here for those who are wondering, I believe it was actually Professor Chris Elmendorf who coined the term builder's remedy for subdivision D5. Now, he didn't come up with the term. It was actually a term that's used in the state of New Jersey to describe a judicial remedy that is available for developers under the Mount Laurel doctrine, a judicially created doctrine in New Jersey that's similar to the builder's remedy. And I think Chris saw that California's statutory version is very similar to the New Jersey version and said, aha, this is our builder's remedy. Now, the other builder's remedy, which we're going to talk about, unfortunately, does not have a catchy name. So for now, I'm just calling it the other builder's remedy, but would love to come up with other things to call it so it doesn't seem like it's, just the other builder's remedy. Anyway, we have another option for cities that have compliant housing elements, which is in many ways very similar to the builder's remedy, and that's why I've called it the other builder's remedy. So let's take a look at it. So I'm just going to show, I know this is a lot of text. I'm going to walk you through the text a little and then kind of break down what it all means. All right, so starting here with subdivision D, subdivision D, the way that the law is sort of framed is it's framed in the negative, telling cities what they can't do. And here, paragraph D says, essentially, if a housing development has very low or moderate income households, and by the way, that's defined as a housing project under the new law with the applicant's choice of 7% extremely low income, 10% very low, 13% lower, or 100% moderate income, right? So any project containing those affordable percentages. A local agency may not disapprove the housing development or unreasonably condition it unless it makes certain findings based on a preponderance of the evidence, which is a legal term of art, meaning they have to prove more likely than not that one of the following 6 conditions is present, right? The 6th one is the builder's remedy, right? They have to prove that you're not eligible for the builder's remedy. If they can't do that, then they can't deny you based on D6. But the one we're talking about today is D5. D5 says one of the ways in which a jurisdiction can deny your project, even if it has the required affordability, is if it can make findings supported by a preponderance of the evidence that on the date you submitted on the date the application was deemed complete, I'll come back to that, the jurisdiction has a compliant housing element, and the housing development project you're proposing is inconsistent with the jurisdiction zoning ordinance and general plan land use designation. Now you're thinking, okay, how does that help me? Because my city has a compliant housing element and my project is not consistent with the general plan or the zoning. So they can use this paragraph to deny my project. Not so, because D5 is modified by another paragraph. If we go ahead, D5A, this paragraph shall not be utilized to disapprove or conditionally approve a housing development project on a site, including a candidate site for rezoning, that is identified in the jurisdiction's housing element as suitable or available for very low or moderate income housing, and the housing development project is consistent with the density specified in the housing element, even if the project is inconsistent with the general plan and the zoning. By the way, another note, deemed complete here, it does not mean necessarily deemed complete under the Permit Streamlining Act. That is one definition. It can also mean that you've submitted a preliminary application under SB 330. I'm not going to get into the whole process of an SB 330 preliminary application. I addressed that in some of the previous webinars. So this paragraph, or this subparagraph A, modifies D5 and instructs that jurisdictions cannot deny a project even where the jurisdiction has a compliant housing element if all of these conditions are met. So let's break it down with the next slide. So this is all the text, but I want to show you what it all means because this is still a lot of information. So Liz, if you wouldn't mind the next slide. Yeah, what does it all mean? Okay, if a jurisdiction has a compliant housing element, it cannot deny or unreasonably condition the project, even if the project is inconsistent with the general plan land use designation and the zoning. So this is looking a lot like the builder's remedy, which is why we call it the other builder's remedy, as long as the project does 4 things. Here they are. 1, it has to contain the required affordability. right? That is a prerequisite under subdivision D. So it's the same required affordability as you would have under the builder's remedy. Second, the project site is identified in the housing element site inventory as suitable and available for low, very low, or moderate income households. Now, what does that mean? I think I have a sub bullet point here. Yes. Government Code Section 65583.2 C3 of the housing element law provides what it calls default densities for what are considered suitable for lower income households. These are often referred to as Mullen densities. So if the project site is identified for one of those Mullen densities, that's going to mean that it is suitable and available for low, very low, or moderate income households. And by the way, I think I have this in another sub bullet point, maybe? Yes. The Mullen density or default density in metropolitan areas, which is going to be most of Orange County, is a minimum of 30 dwelling units per acre. So if the site inventory of the housing element designates a site as suitable for 30 dwelling units per acre, I don't know why it says inch. That's not 30 dwelling units per inch. It should be per acre. 30 dwelling units per acre or more. The presumption is going to be that that is suitable and available for very low, or moderate income households, as I read the housing element law and the HAA. So that's the second point. The third is the project is consistent with the density specified for the site in the housing element. So as we'll see in a minute, when I compare this with the builder's remedy, you can't do, under the old builder's remedy law, you could do unlimited density. Under the modern one, you can do there's kind of a density that's set by a complicated formula under state law. With this other builder's remedy, the density is going to be fixed by the housing element itself, right? Whatever density they specify for the site and the housing element is going to be the density that you must be consistent with. And fourth is the housing element was substantially compliant on the date that the applicant submitted either a preliminary application under SB 330 or has a complete formal application on that date. Of course, if your city doesn't have a substantially compliant housing element on that date, then you're in builder's remedy territory. It's not designed for them to be able to weasel out of it. It's an either or. Okay, so these are the four things you want to look for. Now, here's an example, right, of an actual city's housing element site inventory, right? So you can see here, just kind of checking off those four boxes we talked about. Suppose you wanted to build a housing project on site number 1 here on these 3 assessor parcel numbered parcels. So if you propose a project on this site, it has the required affordability. Okay, next thing you want to look at is the site suitable and available for low-income housing? Again, I'm looking to those Mullen densities, and I see here, right in this column, sort of 2/3 down, that the dwelling units per acre for this first site are 82 units an acre. For the second one, it's 72. Both of those are above the 30 unit per acre Mullen density. So this site is identified as suitable and available for low-income housing. I think you can also look at the way the housing has been distributed among the income buckets for RHNA purposes. So if the site is designated for very low, or moderate income housing, as it is here, I think you could also say that it is suitable and available for very low, or moderate income housing. Well, it must be if you have allocated some number of very low, or moderate income units to those categories for purposes of your RHNA numbers. So this is what if those who are thinking about using this other builder's remedy, this is what you're going to be doing. You're going to look at your city's site inventory and see what sites are designated for housing at the Mullen densities. And then you can propose housing on those sites as long as it is consistent with the density. So for number 1, 82 units an acre. For number 2, 72 units per acre. So that's kind of the game of checking to see if a site in your city's site inventory is something that you can use as a housing element site for purposes of the other builder's remedy. And again, if you're able to meet those four requirements, then the city is not going to be able to deny the project or unreasonably condition it, even if the project is inconsistent with the zoning and general plan. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about, I mean, so much talk again about the builder's remedy. What's the same? What's different? Let's start with what's different. The most obvious one, of course, as we've talked about, is for builder's remedy, the city has to have a housing element that's not in compliance with state law. For the other builder's remedy, it must be in compliance. We just talked a bit about density. Under the builder's remedy, there's a formula for determining the maximum density. In my previous webinar, I said that in most cases, the builder's remedy density is going to be 45 units per acre. That's just how it works out with the formula that the state has provided with AB 1893. Under the other builder's remedy, it's going to be set by the HE itself, right? So, for example, in the example I just showed you, right, where it says on that one site, 82 units per acre, right? That's probably going to be your max or somewhere in that range. The applicability of the density bonus law is a little bit different for the other builder's remedy. So AB 1893 says a builder's remedy project gets 2 extra density bonus concessions. The other builder's remedy does not get any additional concessions. I think that might be something the legislature wants to look at in future sessions, because I don't see why the other builder's remedy project shouldn't get extra concessions too, but that's the way the law is written right now. Density, in terms of the actual density bonus, so the question might be raised, okay, well, the housing element says I can do 80 units an acre, but if I'm doing 20% affordable, does that mean I can throw a density bonus on top of the 80 units an acre? For the other builder's remedy, it looks like no, the way that the density bonus law is currently written. The density bonus law says you can get a density bonus above the maximum density in the general plan land use element or the zoning ordinance, but not the housing element. Builder's remedy, though, you can increase the maximum density with the density bonus. So that's one difference. But by the way, I'm going to come back on my next slide when I tell you what's the same. Some cities have made the mistake of saying that because you don't get a density bonus with the other builder's remedy, that also means you don't get to use concessions and waivers. That's not true. This is only true for the actual density bonus part of the density bonus law. Okay, streamlining under SB 35 or AB 2011 is something that the legislature has made clear is available for traditional builder's remedy. Not as clear if it applies to the other builder's remedy. Same goes for the 5-hearing maximum under the Housing Crisis Act. The AB 1893 makes clear the 5-hearing maximum now applies to builder's remedy projects. It's not clear if that applies to the other builder's remedy. Again, I think the legislature was probably paying more attention last year to the builder's remedy, and maybe in this session they'll start paying more attention to the other builder's remedy. Okay, next slide, we'll see what's the same. Okay, so affordability is the same as we talked about. Here's another big one. Okay, the legislation in 1893 does make very clear that a jurisdiction cannot require compliance with the general plan or zoning, cannot request a general plan amendment or a rezoning under either the traditional builder's remedy or the other builder's remedy. Density bonus, I just alluded to this before, although you cannot get a density bonus under the other builder's remedy, you can get concessions and waivers. As long as you are doing the required affordability percentage, which of course you must, in order to use either the builder's remedy or the other builder's remedy, you are entitled to unlimited waivers and the number of concessions corresponding to the amount of affordability. So absolutely, you can use the density bonus concessions waivers, and I should also have put parking ratios too. Development standards. This is one that was talked about. I think it's a big deal. And again, the legislature made clear this applies to both types, the traditional and the other builder's remedy. Local government can only apply objective quantifiable standards. Here we're talking about things like setbacks, subdivision standards, parking rules, right? Those kinds of things. The local government can only apply those standards if they are objective and quantifiable, if they do not render the project as it's proposed by the applicant infeasible, and the applicant can use the density bonus concessions and waivers to modify or eliminate any of those standards. And that applies to both the traditional and the other builder's remedy, which again is especially nice because you can still use concessions and waivers with the other builder's remedy. So the rules as they apply to the jurisdiction's ability to apply development standards applies the same for the traditional builder's remedy and the other builder's remedy. I think that's very, very powerful. The next one, I think I already said this, but it's good to reiterate. The project cannot be required to obtain any kind of legislative approval, such as a general plan amendment or a rezoning. The reason this is really, really significant, aside from the fact that you don't have to go through the hassles and everything of doing a GPA and a rezoning, is that approvals that are considered legislative in nature, like a GPA or a rezoning, can go to the voters, right? The voters can overturn a rezoning. The voters can overturn a general plan amendment. But other types of approvals, so-called quasi-judicial approvals, are not subject to voter approval. So the way I read this, for both types of projects, they cannot go to the voters. The voters cannot reject a builder's remedy or other builder's remedy project using the power of the voter initiative or referendum. So that's a pretty big deal. And then for purposes of the infill exemption, both types of projects I think would be deemed consistent. There's language in the new law, AB 1893, saying that both types of projects are deemed consistent with applicable standards for all purposes. And I think that was intended to mean such projects should qualify for the infill exemption. As long obviously you still have to meet all the other requirements, but one of the big ones is always, are you consistent with the city's general plan and zoning? AB 1893 says whether it's builder's remedy or other, yes, you qualify. Okay, so that's a breakdown of some of the similarities and differences between the traditional builder's remedy and the other builder's remedy. Now, you might be thinking, well, the other builder's remedy doesn't sound as good, right? It's got a lot of the same stuff, but what's different, it just isn't as strong. I don't think that's entirely true, and here's why, because of what comes next. CEQA. I think the other builder's remedy actually gives you additional leverage with CEQA versus the traditional builder's remedy. And we all know CEQA, in substance, is one of the biggest obstacles we have to deal with. So in a traditional builder's remedy context, of course, your city doesn't have a compliant housing element. Your city might not even have adopted a housing element. So they don't necessarily have any CEQA document associated with their housing element. Nothing that you could use for your project as a CEQA document you can tier from, that you can say, well, we don't need to do additional environmental review because you've already done the environmental review for your housing element. They most likely haven't done that if they don't have a compliant housing element. However, in the context of the other builder's remedy, by definition, the city will have a compliant housing element, which means they have to have adopted the housing element, which very likely means they will have certified an EIR analyzing the impacts of development on the inventory sites at the prescribed densities. And of course, a project using the other builder's remedy under D5A will be on one of the inventory sites at the prescribed density in the housing element, which means it looks like most of the, if not all, of the environmental impacts associated with building at that density on that site would already have been analyzed as part of the housing element's EIR. And that means you may be in the territory where the 15183 exemption applies. Okay, so the regulation states projects consistent with the density established by existing general plan policies for which an EIR was certified shall not require additional environmental review, right? So here, except, we'll get to the except in a minute, right? So again, if you're doing a project under D5A, that means your project is on a site identified in the housing element inventory. It means you're building at the density that's already been analyzed, and you now have a general plan policy, a housing element with which your project is consistent. So it fits right in with that language. Now, the 15183 is complicated, and there's more to it than what I just read. For example, cities can consider the peculiar impacts of the project, effects that are not analyzed in the EIR, and so forth. But this very recent case from just about a year ago, the Hilltop Group case from San Diego, is a very, very good case that I think could be very influential. It reads 15183 extremely broadly to mean, among other things, that an applicant has an implied right to sue the city if it fails to issue the 15183 exemption. And it also reads the peculiar impact language quite narrowly. So cities can't like pretextually say, oh, your project has some peculiar impacts we didn't analyze in the previous EIR. So applicants are going to be able to cite this case to cities and say, you know, you're going to have to process this as a 15183 exemption under the Hilltop case. And again, that's an option that's available if your project is or your project site is in the inventory. That I think is going to certainly be harder if it's a builder's remedy project because you may not have a housing element with a certified EIR. So that's an area where I think the other builder's remedy could be really powerful, maybe more powerful than the traditional builder's remedy. Okay, next one. Oh, okay. So the last sort of substantive slide, I think, and then I'm going to wrap up, is dealing with some of the process changes in AB 1893 that benefit all housing projects, not just projects that are, you know, either under the builder's remedy or the other builder's remedy. So the big thing here is that the legislature has expanded the definition of what it means to have a disapproval under the HAA. And the reason this is significant is because cities would traditionally always play all kinds of games with you and then tell you you have no recourse because we haven't actually denied your project yet, right? But so that's what the HAA is doing, is it's expanding what counts as a denial, which means, next couple of bullet points, please, it means you can take the city to court right away, or at least threaten them and say, look, you can't pull these games anymore because it's deemed to be a disapproval, and we can go right to court. And furthermore, when we go to court, if we win, we can get you to pay the attorney's fees, because as you may know, under the HAA, if an applicant wins, the city has to pay all of their attorney's fees. So this is a good cudgel. Okay, so anyway, let's talk about how the HAA now defines disapproval, right? It used to define it to mean, you know, the council votes to disapprove the project. That's not, you know, super helpful. Now it defines it to mean a lot of other things. So first of all, a course of conduct for purpose of harassment or delay. You can treat that as a denial. So if the city is continuously doing stuff to delay your project or to increase your costs, and then says, well, we're not denying it, we just want you to go through all these hoops, you could treat that as a denial. Of course, the key here is it has to be a course of conduct, can't just be an isolated incident. And there is some unhelpful language in there saying that this excludes CEQA. So forcing you to go through a lengthy CEQA process for the purposes of harassment or delay would not necessarily be a disapproval under this language. Now, I think the reason the legislature did this is because last year the legislature passed AB 1633, which actually also changed the definition of disapproval to include situations where cities play games with CEQA. So I think the goal here was, if you're concerned about what the city is doing with you on CEQA stuff, you take them to court under AB 1633. I addressed that a little bit in the previous webinar. This course of conduct disapproval is intended for other situations where the city asks you to pay more fees and endlessly submits you to delays without it being necessarily related to CEQA. Okay, the next definition of disapproval, if they hold more than 5 hearings, again, if your project qualifies, so a builder's remedy project or a project under subdivision J of the HAA that complies with all the city's land use standards, city can only hold 5 hearings. Before this, there was always a question about, well, what happens if the city exceeds the 5 hearing max? I mean, does that mean that you just kind of ignore it? Like, does that mean you could take them right to court? Now it means yes, you can take them right to court. right? If they try to hold 6 hearings on the project, you can say that's a disapproval. And that's good. Oh, it's not good for them. It's good for you. Okay, so next, if the city makes an improper incompleteness determination, we all know this is something that cities are doing all the time. It's becoming more and more of an issue. I was kind of alluding to this earlier, that cities are playing more procedural games now with projects because the substance is getting better for applicants. They know they can't deny the project because it's inconsistent with the zoning. So instead they say, oh, your application is incomplete. And they do that for a year and a half, right? And hope that you're going to run out of money. All right. Well, now the law says if they make an improper incompleteness determination, you could treat that as a denial and take them to court. Okay. Next one. Yeah, and also if the application is deemed incomplete after 2 resubmittals, it's presumed to be a denial, which is very helpful. And then the final one is if the city improperly claims that a preliminary application has expired. Yes, I've seen this one too, and I'm sure a lot of other people have. HCD and some of the courts have weighed in, actually on all of these, which is why the legislature has now addressed them. These are all examples of things cities are trying to do, and the city is making it harder for them to do. If the city improperly claims that your preliminary application has expired, you can treat that as a disapproval as well. Okay, so those are all, I think, really, really helpful for applicants and make it harder for cities to, kind of do these roundabout procedural mechanisms for effectively denying projects without saying they're denying it. Okay, so that's some of the process changes, and that leads me to the wrap up. Yes, the other builder's remedy is weaker than the traditional builder's remedy in some ways, right? Your density is probably going to be a little less. There's some questions about whether you can use SB 35 and so on. But the potential to ease the CEQA pathway to me is really exciting because we all know how difficult it is dealing with CEQA. So that's, I think, really useful. And then, of course, the big process changes. It's kind of a cat and mouse game between cities and the states. Cities play games, states crack down, cities try new ways to play games, state then has to crack down some more. So we'll see where that's going to keep going. But for now, I think it's really, really good and is helping applicants out a lot that the state has sort of stepped in to expand the definition of a disapproval. So I hope that was really helpful to you. This is kind of my wrap up of some of the other changes to AB 1893, supplementing my previous webinar where I talked mostly about changes under 1893 to the builder's remedy. So I think I've done all of AB 1893 now. But if not, let me know, and maybe we'll do another webinar. But hopefully this was helpful in rounding out your knowledge of the HAA and the builder's remedy.
All
With
right.
that, I'll turn it over to Liz. Thank you so much again. Appreciate everybody being here. Look forward to your comments and questions. Especially eager to know if you have a better name for the other builder's remedy.
Awesome. 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 Thanks so much, Ken. We are gathering feedback about our webinar series, so please do give us your feedback. We'll take questions. Oh, Mr. Eckenweiler, go ahead, raise your hand. Or unmute yourself. Sorry, you raised your hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey, Ken. Um, I just wanted to touch on the density bonus interaction. You said your read of the statute was that you can't use density bonus to bump above the density allowed by the housing element. And if I'm understanding correctly, that's because D5A says that the project has to be consistent with the density specified in the housing element. Is that right?
No. So that's because the
Oh,
density bonus law, the way it defines a maximum, the base density or the maximum residential density, is the density in the general plan land use element or the zoning ordinance.
okay. Okay, cool. Thanks.
So that's that. I mean, I'd be delighted if you prove me wrong on that, but that's the way I read that language.
That makes sense.
Anybody else have any questions they want to put in the chat, or feel free to unmute? Either it went over everybody's head, or after the 4th webinar, you've answered every question.
You're right. I think you're right. After 4 times,
Yeah.
I think I finally got it right, and there's no more questions
There's
anybody
no
can.
more questions out there.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, going once, Going twice. Anybody want to weigh
I'd
in?
be curious to know, by the way, I mean, is anybody dealing with the other builder's remedy where they're trying to build a project on a site in the housing element?
So I have a
Um,
that I
oh,
can.
okay, yeah, okay.
Yes. So
So we could talk about that, but I'm just curious. I mean, I'd like to. I mean, I am aware of a few, but I'd like to
right.
know to get a bit, because builder's remedy, of course, you're hearing about all kinds of things. I haven't heard quite as many about the other builder's remedy.
Anyone want to share their experience, notes from the field? Well, there's one that we're facing in a city that shall not be named for now, but it did pop up earlier in this webinar where we have a project that is in the site, in the site's inventory in the housing element. It fits the criteria, and the city is telling the applicant that, they don't like the project, right? Even though it's not maximizing the density under which would be allowed under the housing element in the specific plan that governs that area. Um, and so it's just really interesting to see the city go through the exercise of, identifying sites, zoning them appropriately, and then, 18 months later, when someone actually comes forward with an actual project, suddenly the site is not the right site and the density is too much. And you're like, but wait a second. This was your document. This was your policy document. No one is forcing this upon you. These are the places you identified as being willing to accommodate new housing development. And these are the densities at which you said that you would move it forward. And now you're not moving it forward. You're, doing everything you can to slow the process down in the hopes that, as you said, they just go away. So,
Yeah, I mean, this is not, in some ways, this is the way the law is designed to work, in that cities are required to identify sites for purposes of satisfying the state. That doesn't necessarily mean they want housing there. And so then once they've done that, they try to prevent the housing. One question is, can or will the state actually step in to do something in situations where cities are not approving housing on sites where they've committed? So are we going to see HCD decertifying housing elements if cities aren't meeting the commitments? Are we going to see the Attorney General bringing suit against cities that aren't approving housing on site inventories? I don't
are we
know.
willing to see the AG's office bring lawsuits against cities that aren't thumbing their nose at the state with flags in a parade? Because we have some cities in Orange County that do thumb their nose with flags in a parade. And then we have some cities that go about it quietly. And I'm hoping that the politics is not, what's driving the decisions around who gets to be, brought into court and forced into compliance, and, who gets a pass because they don't, they quietly thumb their nose.
Right. No, I agree with that. And if this is also an issue we have under subdivision J of the HAA, where it only applies if the city has designated the property for housing. So yeah, it's very interesting and striking to see cities committing to providing housing on a certain site, and then when there's an actual proposal, they say no. Some of this is, of course, the local politics. Folks who are opposed to projects, they don't come out for a planning document. They don't
Right.
care about a housing element. That's just a piece of paper. What they're going to care about is when an actual developer shows up with renderings and says, here's what I want to build, and that's going to be right there next to your house. Then people start to get mad and they start to organize, and then they start to complain. Where was the process? Oh, there was a process. You just didn't pay attention to the process. And so that's how I think the politics kind of plays out. But the way the law is written and the way it's supposed to be applied is, look, this was all done pursuant to a process that you had an opportunity to participate in. You didn't. This site got chosen. Now that's a commitment that the city has to meet.
Correct. Indeed. All right. Well, we still have a little time, but it doesn't seem like we have much of a talkative crowd today. Anybody want to ask a question before we give you back your 15 minutes of the afternoon? Planner's panacea.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then with that, we will say thank you again, Ken. You are my most frequent recurring guest speaker.
That's a great honor.
Really appreciate you and all of the breaking down that you do of this law. because it is dense, even for those of us that, think about it all the time. So appreciate everybody and hope that your 2025 is off to a good start. And
Yes.
we'll see you next time.
Yes. Happy New Year, everyone. Hope to talk to you soon.
All right. Take care,
Bye.
everybody.